I felt the poison burn through my veins, a slow creeping fire, stealing my breath, weakening my limbs, killing me. And the worst part? They were watching. My husband sat across from me, swirling his wine. His eyes were cold, unbothered. Beside him, his mistress smiled, not in pity, not in sadness, but in satisfaction, because this was their plan all along, and I had walked right into it. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My fingers trembled as I reached for my throat, for the last bit of strength, for anything. But there was nothing left, because I was dying, and they were already celebrating. I felt my body collapse onto the floor, the world spinning, my vision blurring, and then his voice, cold, amused, final. You were always too naive. I gasped, my chest tightening. You never saw it coming, he murmured. I turned my head, struggling to keep my eyes open, to see them one last time. And then, darkness. I should have died that night. I did die that night. But when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the afterlife. I wasn't in a grave. I wasn't gone. I was in my bedroom, alive, whole, breathing. And the date on the calendar? It was 1 month before my death. I sat up, my hands shaking. This wasn't real. This wasn't possible. But the truth was staring me in the face. I had been reborn. A wave of emotions crashed over me. Confusion, shock, then rage. Because I knew what was coming. I knew what my husband was planning. I knew how he and his mistress were going to kill me. And this time, I wasn't going to let it happen. I moved to the mirror, staring at my own reflection. The woman I saw was not the same woman who had once trusted too easily, who had once loved a man who never loved her back, who had once died believing she was worthless. No, that woman was gone. And the woman standing here now? She was going to make them suffer. I walked downstairs, my heartbeat steady. There he was, sitting at the dining table, reading the newspaper like he wasn't planning my murder, like he wasn't already choosing the day I would die. He looked up when he saw me, smiled. Good morning, darling. I stared at him, at the man who had once held me in his arms while secretly plotting my death, at the man who had once promised forever but only meant until it was convenient. And for the first time, I saw him for who he truly was, a traitor, a liar, a man who was going to choke on his own betrayal. I forced a smile. Good morning. His eyes flickered, like he sensed something was different, like he could tell I was no longer the fool he had married. Good. Let him feel it. Let him feel the first taste of the fear I would make him drown in. Because I wasn't his wife anymore. I was his reckoning. The first step was pretending I didn't know. Because if I showed my hand too early, he would change the plan. He would find a new way to kill me. So I had to be careful, patient. I had to let him believe I was still the same clueless woman who trusted him. I had to let him believe he was still in control. Because when he finally realized the truth, it would already be too late. For the next few days, I played my role perfectly. I smiled at him. I let him kiss my cheek like he wasn't plotting my murder. I let him hold me at night like he hadn't once let me die on a cold, hard floor. But deep inside, I was already planning how to destroy him, because the night of my death was coming. And this time, he was the one who wouldn't survive it. The real test came when I saw her, his mistress, the woman who had stood beside him as he watched me die, the woman who had poisoned my drink, the woman who had smiled as I took my last breath. And now, she was smiling at me again. Like nothing had happened, like she hadn't once been my executioner. She approached me at an afternoon gathering, fake concern painted on her face. You look exhausted, she murmured, tilting her head. I smiled. Doi. She nodded. Are you sleeping well? Ah. She was checking to see if I was sick yet. If the slow, silent poison had already started to take effect. If the plan was already in motion. She didn't know. She was speaking to a dead woman, a woman who had already seen her future and changed it. I reached out, touching her wrist lightly. She stilled, surprised. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Infine, he whispered. Better than ever, actually. She hesitated, just for a second, but I caught it. The doubt, the confusion. because she had expected me to be weak, to be clueless, to be dying. But I wasn't. I was just getting started. The night of the poisoning was approaching. I had memorized every detail of my death. The way he would lead me to the dining room. The way she would pour the wine, smiling sweetly. The way he would raise his glass, making a toast to our future, knowing I wouldn't live to see it. And then, the way I would drink the poison unknowing, unaware. But this time, the glass he raised would be his own death sentence. Because I wasn't going to stop the poisoning. I was just switching the glass. I stood in the mirror, watching my own reflection, feeling the weight of what was coming, what I was about to do. And I felt nothing. No fear.
No guilt. No hesitation.
Because he had already killed me once. And this time, I was the one holding the knife. I walked downstairs that evening, found him waiting, found her watching. The glasses already set on the table. And I smiled, because I already knew. Tonight, history would repeat itself. But this time, he would be the one gasping for breath. He would be the one watching as his world turned black. And I would be the one smiling. Because this time, I was the one in control. The night of my death was approaching. But this time I wasn't afraid. This time I was waiting for it. Because the poison had already been prepared. The wine glasses had already been set. The only difference? The glass he would lift to his lips would be the one that killed him. For days I played my role perfectly. Smiling when my husband kissed me. Laughing when his mistress made sly comments. Acting like the same naive woman they thought they had control over. But inside, I was counting down the moments, waiting for the night I would finally see him gasp for air the way I once did. Waiting for the moment he would realize what betrayal truly felt like. Waiting for justice. My husband was confident. Too confident. He still believed I was blind. Still believed he was the one in control. Still believed I would never see what was coming. And that was exactly what I wanted. Because men like him never fear what they can't see. And the moment he realized his mistake would be the moment he took his last breath. The night before the poisoning, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, at the woman I used to be, at the woman who had once been too trusting, too kind, too easy to destroy. But that woman was dead. And the one standing here now? She was a ghost haunting her killers. She was the one who had come back for revenge. At dinner, the final test came. My husband took my hand, rubbing soft circles over my skin. An act. A lie. A performance. He thought I couldn't feel the coldness in his touch, the lack of love in his voice, the anticipation in his eyes, because he was waiting for the moment I would drink the poison, waiting for the moment I would disappear, waiting to be free of me. But instead, he was walking straight into his own execution. His mistress was there too, sitting across from me watching, measuring, calculating, because she thought she had already won, because she thought I would be dead by sunrise. I met her gaze, smiled, and for the first time I saw it, the tiniest flicker of doubt, like she could sense deep down that something wasn't quite right, like she could feel that maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated me. Good. She should be afraid, because tonight, she would watch everything fall apart. I excused myself from the table early, walking toward the grand hallway where the servants were preparing the wine. The two identical glasses. One meant for me, one meant for my husband, a drink that would end a life. And this time, it wouldn't be mine. The servant bowed when he saw me. "The wine is ready, madam." I smiled warmly. "Thank you," I said. Then as he turned away I moved. Quick, silent, precise, switching the glasses, sealing his fate. Because when he lifted his glass in that final toast, when he smirked, believing he had already won, he would be drinking his own death. I returned to the dining hall, my hands steady. The glasses were carried in, placed carefully in front of us. 2 cups of fate, one leading to freedom, one leading to death. And for the first time in my life, I was in control of which one was mine. My husband smiled, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," he said smoothly. His mistress giggled softly, lifting her own drink. I met his gaze, lifted my glass, and whispered, "To fate." Then together we drank. I placed my glass down gently, letting the taste settle on my tongue, letting the room fall into quiet conversation, letting him believe everything was fine. And for a moment, it was. Until the first cough. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but then came the second cough, then the third, then the sound of his glass slipping from his fingers, hitting the table, spilling, spreading like blood on white linen. And then, he gasped. His hands clutched at his throat, his body trembled, his vision blurred. I watched as panic filled his eyes, watched as his breath grew shallow, watched as the realization finally hit him. This wasn't my death. It was his. He turned to me, his lips parted, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say, because he had already lost. And now, he was choking on his own betrayal. The room fell into chaos. People rushed to him, shouted for help, but it was too late, because this was always how it was meant to be. The only difference? He had taken my place. And I was still standing. His mistress screamed his name, tried to shake him, tried to bring him back. But it was over. And the best part? She knew it. I leaned forward, just enough for only her to hear me. And in a whisper laced with victory, I said, "You should have made sure I stayed dead." Her breath hitched. Her hands tightened in panic. Her eyes filled with terror. Because she knew. She was next. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. I stood slowly, brushing invisible dust off my dress. Then, without another word, I walked away. Because my revenge had only just begun. His body hit the floor. Lifeless. Cold. Gone. And for the first time I watched him fall instead of me. The room was chaos. People screamed. Servants rushed in. Someone shouted for a doctor. But I stood still. Calm. Watching. Because I had already seen this moment before. I had already lived this death. The only difference? It wasn't mine this time. His mistress was the first to break. She dropped to her knees beside him, shaking him. "Wake up," she whispered. "This isn't funny." He didn't move. Her hands trembled as she turned to me. And when I saw her face, I almost laughed. Because for the first time, she was feeling what I had once felt. The fear. The horror. The realization that everything was falling apart. And I had never looked stronger. She scrambled to her feet, her voice rising. "What did you do?" I tilted my head. "Me? I did exactly what you did to me. But I didn't say it. Not yet. Because she needed to suffer. Because she needed to feel the walls closing in. And when she finally understood, it would already be too late." The whispers started almost instantly. Eyes turned to me. Curious. Suspicious. Because they all knew he had raised the glass first. That he had made the toast. That I had simply followed. And now he was the one choking on his own sins. And I was still standing. I watched as the doctors arrived, but I already knew. He was gone. Just like I had been. Only this time, no one was crying for him. Because powerful men don't get sympathy when they fall. They get devoured. And his empire? It was already crumbling. The next morning, the first headline was printed. Tragedy or poison. Wealthy businessman dies mysteriously at grand event. I sat at my vanity brushing my hair, reading the words slowly, savoring them. Because this was just the beginning. His mistress had vanished. I expected it. She was a rat caught in a sinking ship. A woman who had used a man until there was nothing left. And now she was running for her life. Because she knew. Without him she was vulnerable. And I was coming for her next. I let her panic. Let her scramble for a way out. Let her think she could escape the fate she had created for herself. Because when people run, they make mistakes. And she was about to make her biggest one yet. 2 days after his death, she showed up at my estate. Uninvited. Unannounced. Desperate. The guards hesitated, looking to me. "Let her in," I said. Because this was the moment I had been waiting for. She stormed inside, her once perfect hair now a tangled mess. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was uneven. Good. She should be afraid. Because she had walked into my trap. Her voice was sharp. You did this. I smiled. What exactly did I do? Her lip curled. You killed him. I tilted my head. Did I? She took a step closer, her fury barely contained. You knew, she hissed. I hummed. Of course I knew. She froze. Because I had just confirmed it. I knew what they had planned. I knew about the poison. And I had let it happen anyway. Her breath hitched. You switched the glasses. I took a slow step forward, closing the space between us. Then in the softest whisper I said, I did. Her entire body went still. Her nails dug into her palms. You won't get away with this. I laughed. Low, amused, unbothered. I already have. She shook her head, stumbling backward. You don't understand, she whispered. They'll come after you. I raised an eyebrow. They. Her breath stuttered. And that's when I saw it. The mistake. The crack. The truth she had just revealed without meaning to. Because she wasn't acting alone. There was someone else. Someone higher. Someone who had helped them plan my murder. And now I was going to burn them all. I let out a slow, deliberate sigh. Tell me who you work for. She swallowed hard. I don't. I cut her off. You're out of options. Her lips parted. Her fingers trembled. She was breaking. Good. Let her break. Let her feel the weight of the truth crashing down on her. Because when she finally confessed, I would use that truth to bury the rest of them. She inhaled sharply. And then, she spoke a name. A name I already knew. A name that made my blood turn cold. And when I heard it, I smiled. Because the real enemy was someone I had never seen coming. And now, they were next. She said the name. And the world shifted. Everything I thought I knew about my own death. The betrayal, the poison, the lies. It wasn't just him. It wasn't just his mistress. There was someone else. A name I had once trusted. A name I had never suspected. And now, they were my real enemy. I stared at the mistress, watching her shake. Her once flawless confidence was gone. Because now she realized. She wasn't the predator anymore. She was the prey. And I was the one holding the leash. I leaned forward, letting the moment sink in. You betrayed me. Her breath hitched. You poisoned me. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I tilted my head, smiling softly. And now you expect me to let you live? Her entire body tensed. Her fingers trembled. She was waiting for the final blow. Waiting to die. But I wasn't going to kill her. Not yet. Because dead people don't talk. And I needed her to keep talking. I let the silence stretch. Let her feel the weight of my power. Then in a voice so quiet it sent a shiver down her spine, I whispered, Tell me everything. And she did. She told me how it all began. How my husband had never truly loved me. How I had been nothing but a placeholder until he could secure his fortune. How the plan to kill me had been set long before the night I drank that wine. And then, she told me about the person who helped them. The person who had paid for the poison. The person who had ensured my death would be covered up. The person who had benefited from my downfall. Someone I had once called family. My father. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. Of course it was him. I had trusted him more than anyone. Believed he would always protect me. And all along, he had been counting down the days until I was gone. The mistress flinched at the sound of my laughter. She was still shaking, still waiting for her punishment. I met her gaze, tilting my head. What should I do with you? I murmured. She inhaled sharply. I told you everything. Please. I smiled. Cold. Ruthless. Unforgiving. And you think that erases your sins? Her lip trembled. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper. You were the one who poured the poison. She let out a soft, broken sob. I was following orders. I smiled wider. So was I. Her brows furrowed in confusion. I stood, brushing invisible dust from my sleeve. Then I turned to the guards at the door. Take her away. She gasped. No. Wait. Please. Her screams echoed down the halls as she was dragged from my sight. And I felt nothing. Because this was exactly what she deserved. That night I sat in front of the fireplace, my father's name burning in my mind. He had betrayed me. He had killed me, and now I was going to destroy him. The next morning I started preparing. I gathered every piece of information. I traced every secret account, every hidden deal, every illegal transaction. Because if I was going to take him down, I wasn't going to do it quietly. I was going to make sure the whole world watched as he fell. The first move was subtle. I leaked just enough information to raise suspicion. A missing sum of money. A deal that wasn't as legal as it seemed. Just enough to put eyes on him. Because once people start watching you, once they start asking questions, everything falls apart on its own. My father noticed the shift immediately. He wasn't stupid. He could feel the unease in his business partners. He could sense the change in his employees. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was being hunted. Because he was. By me. A week later, he summoned me to his estate. The same place I had once called home. The same place he had once plotted my death. I walked through the doors, my heart steady. I wasn't afraid anymore. Because now, I was the threat. He was waiting for me in his study. The same desk. The same cold expression. But this time, there was something else in his eyes. Something I had never seen before. Doubt. Like he could sense something was wrong. Like he knew something was coming. Good. Let him feel it. Let him feel the first taste of the fear I had once drowned in. Because this time, he was the one who wasn't going to survive. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You've been busy," he said smoothly. I smiled. "I always am." A pause. Then his eyes narrowed. "Did you kill him?" I tilted my head, pretending to think. Would it matter if I did? His jaw tensed. Because we both knew the answer. No. He hadn't cared when I died. Why should I care about my husband's death now? He exhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "I hear rumors." I raised a brow. "Do you?" He tapped a finger against the desk. "Rumors that you're digging into things that don't concern you." I hummed. "That's funny," I said softly. "Because I'm only looking into the things that concern me the most." His eyes darkened. "You don't know what you're playing with." I leaned forward. "Yes," I whispered. "Idol." He stilled. For the first time, he realized. I wasn't his daughter anymore. I wasn't his victim anymore. I was his executioner. And soon, he would know exactly what that meant. I stood smoothing out my dress. Then before I left, I turned to him one last time. And in the coldest whisper I had ever spoken, I said, "I hope you're ready." His breath caught. I smiled. "Because your downfall has already begun." And then I walked away, leaving my father sitting in his own fear. Because now, he was the one running out of time. Fear. It was in my father's eyes. He tried to hide it, tried to pretend he was still in control. But I saw through it, because for the first time, he knew what it felt like to be hunted. And I was the one holding the blade. The moment I walked out of his office, the war had begun. He would fight. Of course he would. Men like him don't go down quietly. But that didn't matter. Because I had spent years learning how he operated. And this time, I was the one pulling the strings. The first real move came the next morning. The whispers turned into headlines. The first wave of financial scandals leaked to the press. The board of his company, demanding answers. His investors, losing confidence. And him, backed into a corner. Just where I wanted him. I sat in my office sipping tea, reading the news. Fraud? New evidence suggests CEO's wealth is not as clean as it seems. Family betrayal? Mysterious reports surface on hidden deals and unaccounted funds. I smiled. Because this was only the beginning. My father tried to contain the damage. Called in favors. Tried to silence the media. Tried to find out who was behind it. But there was a problem. He had made too many enemies. And when a powerful man starts to fall, people love to watch him crash. 2 days later, he called for me again. A private meeting. Same office. Same chair. But this time, he looked different. Less confident. Less powerful. And that was already a victory. I walked in slowly, letting the silence stretch. He tapped his fingers against the desk, trying to mask his frustration. Finally, he spoke. "What do you want?" I smiled. "Oh, Father," I said sweetly. Shouldn't you already know? His jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. I tilted my head. A mistake? I echoed. Like the one you made when you tried to kill me? His breath hitched. For the first time, he didn't have a response, because there was nothing he could say. Nothing that would erase what he did. And now, he was the one on trial. He leaned forward, voice low. You think you're winning? I met his gaze, unblinking. I don't think, I whispered. I know. His hands curled into fists. Do you even understand what you've started? I let out a soft laugh. Oh, Ido. I placed my hands on his desk, leaning closer. I started your downfall. His breath hitched. And that's when I saw it. The fear settling in. The realization that he couldn't stop what was coming. And the best part? He had no one left to blame but himself. I stepped back, smoothing out my dress. I'll see you at the next board meeting. His eyes narrowed. What? I smiled. You didn't think I came back just to ruin your reputation, did you? He stilled. I turned toward the door. The company is mine now. I glanced over my shoulder, giving him one final look. And soon? You won't exist in it at all. And then, I walked away, leaving him in his own destruction. I had waited for this moment. The final strike. The moment he would lose everything. The moment he would understand what it felt like to be powerless. And now, that moment had arrived. The boardroom was silent. The tension thick enough to suffocate. My father sat at the head of the table. Or at least he used to. Now, he was sitting among the board members. Because his title had already been stripped from him. And today, I was going to take everything else. I walked in slowly, taking my time. I wanted him to feel it. The weight of his own failure. The sharp edge of the same betrayal he had once given me. His eyes met mine. Cold. Desperate. But I didn't care. Because he had already lost. The meeting began. Legal reports were read. Contracts were reviewed. And finally the moment came. A final vote. A decision that would determine his fate. Would he be removed completely? Would he walk away with nothing? Or would he try to fight? It didn't matter. Because the answer had already been written. And he was the only one who didn't know it yet. The chairman turned to me. You may proceed. I stood, placing a folder on the table. It contained every dirty deal, every hidden transaction, every falsified report. All traced back to my father. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. And as I flipped through the pages, the room turned against him. The whispers grew louder. The tension rose. And my father, he was silent. Because he knew. This was the end. The final vote was cast. Unanimous. My father was out. His name, his legacy erased from the company he built. And me? I was the one sitting in his chair now. The one who had taken back everything he stole from me. And the best part? He couldn't do a thing about it. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress. Then I turned to him. He was still sitting there. Staring. Like he couldn't believe it was real. Like he couldn't believe he had lost. I smiled. Stand up, I said softly. His breath hitched. I tilted my head. This is my chair now. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then slowly, he stood. And for the first time in his life, he looked small, weak, insignificant. Because the power he had once held was gone. And the daughter he had once betrayed was the one who had taken it from him. I stepped past him, taking my seat at the head of the table. Then I lifted my gaze. Security. 2 men stepped forward. My father stiffened. You're escorting me out? I smiled. You don't belong here anymore. His jaw clenched. He looked around the room, like he was searching for someone to take his side. But there was no one left. Because when a king falls, the court moves on. And he was nothing but a dethroned ruler. Security grabbed his arm. He tensed, but he didn't resist. Because what was there to fight for? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I watched as he was escorted out of the boardroom, out of the company, out of the life he had once ruled. And when the doors shut behind him, I let out a slow breath. Because I had one. And he would never recover. The next morning I sat in my office sipping tea. A newspaper lay on my desk. The headline: Fall of a Dynasty, Once Powerful CEO Stripped of Everything. I smiled, because this was the fate he had once written for me. And now, it belonged to him. I expected him to contact me one last time. A final plea. A final attempt to beg for mercy. But he didn't. Because men like him, they don't know how to ask for forgiveness. They only know how to watch as everything slips away. And that was enough for me. The last time I saw him was 3 weeks later. A passing glimpse. I was walking out of a high-profile event. He was standing outside, alone, dressed in a suit that no longer fit his title, watching me, like he wanted to say something, like he wanted to undo what had already been done. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back, because he wasn't worth my time anymore. He had chosen to erase me, and now, I had erased him. I walked into my new life, my new future, and I had never felt lighter, because for the first time, no one could ever betray me again, because I was untouchable now, and my past was buried with the people who tried to destroy me.